Good evening. I'm Sarah Watson, and I'm the director of the Murphy Institute at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this evening's event, How Uber Conquered Washington, D.C., Understanding the Big Tech Playbook for Exploiting Urban Crisis. This program is a live recording for our podcast, Reinventing Solidarity. And tonight we are joined by the co-authors of the new book, Disrupting D.C., The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City, KAFUI Attoh, Katie J. Wells, and DECLAN CULLEN. Katie is a postdoctoral fellow at Georgetown University. KAFUI is an associate professor of urban studies here at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies, and DECLAN is an assistant professor of geography at George Washington University. KAFUI, Katie, and DECLAN will be in conversation this evening with Edward Odweso Jr., a Brooklyn-based writer who focuses on technology, finance, and labor. And Edward is co-host of the podcast, This Machine Kills. At the end of the conversation with Edward, KAFUI, Katie, and DECLAN, we'll open the floor for audience questions. And following that, we will have a book signing with the authors. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I want to acknowledge and thank the many folks here at SLU who are contributing to making this event possible tonight. Nadia, Michael, and Rose, and the public engagement team, Aaron and the communications team, Rick, Sean, and the IT team, and Keisha, Suzette, Hector, Marta, and the operations and finance team. I also want to share about two upcoming programs we have. One on Wednesday, October 25th, we're hosting a live virtual program, The Global Green New Deal and Public Ownership of Energy. And on Friday, November 10th, we'll have an in-person book launch for Practical Radicals, 7 Strategies to Change the World. And at the check-in table, there's a flyer for both of those events, as well as a QR code to access more information and register on our website. So I will turn it over to our speakers, and thank you all so much for joining and for those folks that are joining on the live stream.
Thank you. I think the first question I wanted to have is, Uber is a global company, despite its inability to earn profits, and is in markets all over the world, in cities all over the world. What, drove you guys to zoom in on DC itself and kind of use this as an inside look at the playbook that it has in shaping the way cities engage with it or develop with it?
All right. Before I answer the question, let me also thank the organizers of this event, Sarah Watson, Michael Alon, Nadia Rahman, and Aaron Lechner. This is, organizing 3 co-authors together, it can get complicated, and so I'm just very grateful for all the work that went into this. And I'm also grateful for all the people who showed up. Many of the people here played a really pivotal role in the development of the book, reading drafts, commiserating over drafts. So thank you. Why DC? Well, the first response is convenience. I mean, Katie and Declan live there, and that's not what we put in the proposal when we were, pitching the project. But that was part of it. I think as we did the research, it became clear why DC was so important for understanding the rise of Uber. But that came, through talking with people, through understanding the kind of rollout of Uber in DC. And what became quickly apparent is that DC was a testing ground for all sorts of political strategies that Uber would roll out across the globe. DC was the 6th city, but in which Uber launched, but it would take many of the things, many of the tactics that it developed in DC, and they would appear other places. So that's both the real answer, but there's also the fact that DC really is important, and I think the book makes that clear. But Katie, you want to add?
I would love to talk a bit about those strategies themselves also, because I know that Uber also, in its ascendance in some of these cities, took notes from the playbook that firms had used when they were trying to privatize the taxi industry or deregulate the taxi industry decades earlier. And in your research, was it that you found this playbook was novel developments or extensions of those previous strategies, or that some of those previous strategies didn't make sense in the years that Uber was coming up in DC?
Sure. I think in terms of just the general disruption of taxi industry, it was pretty standard, I would argue. Although the perhaps the difference with DC is that the taxi industry for a long number of years had a very deep problem with kind of just structural racism of the city itself, right? So people of color not being able to get taxis, right, to different neighborhoods, not getting picked up. And so when Uber came to the city, a big kind of constituency, a big support group where people are just sick and tired of taxis, which were, I remember my first time in DC, I've lived there for 8 years, getting in a taxi and looking through the floor, Flintstone style, at the street going by underneath me. It's just like a rusted hole through, and there was things about the taxi system that definitely weren't working. So I think the case for that but I think the way Uber could kind of make that case was quite novel in its appeal to kind of racial inequity, but also just the standard thing of taxis don't work. I think most cities around the world have that kind of feeling, this love-hate relationship with taxi systems. But I think what was really novel about it was which is chapter 1, which Katie wrote about, is this Operation Rolling Thunder, right? Not to be confused with the US bombing campaign of Vietnam and Laos in 1968. I'm not really sure where the name came from. I guess at a tech bro meeting, they decided it was cool. But the idea that kind of Uber could enter illegally into a city, establish a customer base, and then leverage kind of its connection with those consumers to kind of exert political will was kind of novel. So when DC tried to regulate Uber, and minimally, right, it was a floor, right, for pricing on rides, the response was kind of Uber appeals to all these customers. They send how many? 50,000 emails, tweets, texts, and everything to city council overnight. And of course, they panicked and took everything back in. And so I think that was very key to the playbook. That was and I think it was that made us start to think about Uber not just as a technological thing or as an economic thing, but as a political project. And one that was very serious. And I think that was probably the key part of its insights from DC, I would say.
Yeah, and I would add that one thing I think we don't play out in the book, and we haven't played out sort of subsequently, is the connection to the charter school movement and the way in which sort of that 1980s, 1990s Koch brothers arguments about deprivatization sort of play out at different scales. And in DC, there actually was this instance a decade earlier before Uber came where the charter school movement got tremendous hold in DC by making actually what I think could be very similar arguments. Now, they didn't use a collectivism, strategy, but maybe one of you or we will someday write about sort of the parallels, but I think there are more commonalities across time.
So, with those commonalities, did Uber internally or in its communications try to present itself as a political project, or is this something that ends up emerging because of its strategies or because of the ways in which it's engaging with regulators?
I think they were pretty explicit. There's some interviews with Travis Kalanick, who is no longer the CEO, but was, was the founder and then CEO for quite a long time. There are interviews he's doing where he's basically saying, we're running into all sorts of, we're running into politics, right? We're running into resistance from these council people who don't get it, who are backward. We're running into resistance from quote unquote big taxi, right? And so you say what we really need to do is engage in politics, and some of that takes manifests in them hiring David Plouffe as a so they're as a kind of a political apparatchik, an advisor. So I think they were explicit about it, and it was pretty clear early on.
Yeah, I think one of the core threads of your book, in terms of the political project that they propose, also is in their attempts to frame themselves as a solution or a salve to racial inequities that are, whether that's in transportation itself or access to transportation, by using structured racism in the taxi industry, as you talked about and as you talk about in the book. And I was curious because it felt like this was, or when I became aware of Uber's use of this strategy, it felt like one that they had kind of fine-tuned and honed by the time I started seeing it in New York, especially with the Delete Uber campaign, where they were able to flip attempts to call people to delete them because they were trying to break the strike that people imposed at the airport in the midst of the Muslim ban, to flip it on its head and say, if you're against us providing rides for black and brown people, delete us. Could you talk a bit about their experiments with trying to get that messaging and that political strategy down in DC, and how they were able to convince lawmakers that we can help you fight racism, essentially?
Okay, there's the second chapter, which we've titled Uber Kente. We start with a brief anecdote from a pollster named Cornell Belcher, who penned an op-ed in the Washington Post in, I think, 2018, around that period, basically kind of relating his own experience of racism in trying to hit the issue and problem of hailing a cab while black. And we start the chapter with that because, there was almost an immediate correction issued by the Washington Post, which said, what Cornell Belcher didn't reveal is that, his research and had on kind of discrimination in the taxi industry, which was part of the editorial he had written, had been funded by Uber. And part of what we had, we started with that was, this is incredibly cynical, but at the same time, part of what we try to show is that, it's cynical, but it worked because there was an issue that Uber was able to exploit, and an issue that the city for decades had been unable to address, which is broad problems of racial inequity in the broader context of a city that was changing demographically, and that change was causing all sorts of other prompting all sorts of other debates and anxieties. And Uber stepped into the breach. I mean, it's basically that could be, that's the kind of line throughout.
Do you remember that interview? We sat down with an Uber lobbyist,
Right.
Who said to us, "Oh, we're actually going to solve that issue of racism because we're going to bring old DC and new DC together in the cab, so it's going to be all right." And we were sort of like, "I'm sorry, what?" But he was genuine. I mean, we try to, I think in the book what we try to do, right, is we try to push aside that cynicism and say, okay, we're not going to evaluate whether or not the company was cynical in their pronouncements of solutions to racism, and instead ask, what is it about all of us that we're willing to sort of buy that argument a little bit? What is it about all these policymakers that we're willing to say, yeah, maybe this tech company from Palo Alto can come in and help the old DC and new DC get in a car together.
Yeah, that was terrible. Yeah, I mean, but the interesting thing is that when we started when we were writing that chapter, I remember researching the phenomenon of this op-ed, and it was everywhere. It was in Chicago, it was in LA, it was all over, and so all those problems are real in all those cities. But it was quite clear that as a strategy, particularly post #delete Uber, which now has been reappropriated for something else, like Uber realized it had this image problem. And the image problem was due to CULLEN, it was due to all these other things happening at the time. But I think this was a part of a very clear kind of rebranding effort by many companies. But Uber was a big part of that. I mean, tragically, Spike Lee made a movie for them. We all cried.
Still
a little
find
bit.
it on
You can still
YouTube,
find
guys.
It, yeah, about
It's
the
wild.
Brooklyn Hustle.
Yeah.
So and Prop 22 was very strong in California to say like, look, you make these workers workers, right? You give them the protections that entails, and you're going to put a whole load of people of color out of work.
We'll be forced to fire.
We'll be forced to
500,000.
fire all these people, and it kind of worked, right? Which is the sad thing about it. So I would say there was like a very interesting concerted effort to like reframe everything in that.
Yeah, and
manner.
it's almost as if the state was held hostage by its own inadequacies, right?
You're not going to do anything about it. We are doing something about it. So yeah, what's next? And so
I mean, I think there was an interview we did with an elected official. I know. Yes. I've been known to slip up and say actual names of people, so I'm getting better. Yeah, an elected official who, was, it was, a self-described progressive, had been central in, fights over fair wages. I'm looking at you, Katie. Fair wages, minimum wage fights in the city, and we were talking to them about, why did you support Uber? And their response was, it's the racism in the taxi industry. That's basically it. They seem to offer a solution. I got tons of emails that were complaining about the problem of hailing a cab, and they wanted Uber. So we heard it directly from an elected official.
who will remain nameless.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, so in cases like that, Uber does this really interesting switch where it's like consumers become citizens, right? So like the people who vote or the people who email council represent everybody in the city. So it's like it gets to kind of represent democracy in some kind of interesting way. So I think in a lot of the early Uber political stuff, they were kind of able to, as you said, big taxi, to frame themselves as like the little guy fighting, the big bad taxi regulators. And so it was able to, again, to kind of catch on to this thing of well, this is democracy in action, right? As if, consumers equal citizens. But I think that makes sense to a lot of people, right? You vote with your money kind of idea. And in DC, that was a really kind of, I think, strong idea.
Can I add one more note? There was one council member who I will name, whose name was the late Marion Barry, Mayor for Life. And he was, I think, the only council member who added nuance to these arguments about racism and the taxi industry. And in one of the debates, he sort of recounted not being able to have a friend of his, I think from Alabama, get a taxi to go home one night from his Southeast address. And he said to the council members, from the dais, how are we going to have an industry that is less regulated? How is that going to solve racial discrimination? And I felt like he was one of the people that sort of pointed to the real danger of Uber in DC, which is sort of the underlying argument of our book, which is that it really threatened the idea of regulation as a public good.
He was not at the height of his powers at this moment in time. So it's an endorsement from Marion Barry circa whenever it was, but it was kind of representative of an older style of politics, an older style of, an older approach to these questions of regulation.
So, one thing, I know you guys have talked a bit before in the in interviews and on my podcast also about how there was an alternative name for this book, Lowered Expectations, and I'd be really interested in talking a bit about that, especially as you talk about Uber's political project or one of its many hats, which is trying to undermine regulation and expand the arenas in which it can operate in and make money off of it and realize profits that are unprofitable or change labor relations or social relations to figure out a new business model. Why it feels like there's such a sharp contrast between the low expectations of regulators and citizens in the city, and at the same time, sometimes really ambitious plans offered by these companies to kind of restructure everything that we live around. So I guess a two-part question. One, I'd be curious what your thoughts are on these lowered expectations. What do you see as the root of it, if it's a long-standing process or something that particularly emerged out of Uber's ascent? And also, if the other side of that coin of lowered expectations are like really ambitious visions and plans coming from Uber.
I'm the person who's interested most in history, so I take all the futuristic related questions. But it's a really great question. I've never thought about them that much as two sides of the same coin. It strikes me as that's like exactly what it is. I think like probably the lowered expectations. I mean, Ben was working with us on this idea. I mean, the press was just like, no, that's like a bit too Dickens, which is what we liked about it. But and it doesn't say anything about Uber or DC. But that was the core kind of idea. Was this kind of a shift in what we expect from cities, what we expect from each other, what we expect from regulators. But I mean, I guess it's twofold. I mean, you can't really think about the rise of companies like Uber without thinking about, one, the Great Recession. So two facts of that. I mean, one is like it's a big reserve army of labor. And the other one is like just venture capital looking for places to invest in. And that, to me, is like the double thing that allows these companies to exist in this, which I would argue is probably a pretty special kind of time window. I could be totally wrong about it. We'll see. But the expectations then are kind of eroded by, okay, but one, the material conditions of people engaging with the app, or workers especially. But two, of course, like just the long 30, 40-year erosion of like just city governance, or governance more generally, just like neoliberalism, right? Of how we think about ourselves as consumers, how we think about competition, how we think about the role of the government, all these kinds of things. So cities like DC, I mean, we're very critical of the city, but also you can see how they are very much in a rock and a hard place, right? And so there's that kind of like, everybody has low expectations about what a city like DC can do. Regulators have their hands kind of tied, and then a company just comes along and says, we'll fix it all. And they offer these fantastical, like truly ridiculous visions. Like now it's very tempered. If you go back like 10 years ago, they're just like flying cars, like whatever, you have it. We're going to give it to you. And everyone's like, yeah, like every news story is just full of this stuff, and people just ate it up. I was like, people in my work started calling me Chicken Little. Because there's like AVs, where are they? And I was just like, there are no AVs. They're not coming, they're not. And there was like, look at this guy, he doesn't even know they're coming. They'll be here tomorrow. This is like 10 years ago. And so I think which is why one of the reasons we got very interested in the expectations thing was just like the ability of these companies to kind of like offer a clearly kind of fantastical future that for a whole host of reasons, people bought into it, right? Cities, people using the app, and even to some extent workers, right, who are like, you know, thinking about their jobs is obsolete already because they're envisioning an AV coming tomorrow and taking away their work. And so there's this whole kind of ideological aspect that goes way beyond Uber, right? It's just a Silicon Valley kind of produced vision of the future that I think a lot of people have bought hook, line, and sinker. But I think we're probably on the moment where it's starting to fray a little bit. So I would hope there's some room to contest that terrible 10 years we went through.
Well, I was going to add, I think one of the main contributions of the book is that, you know, one doesn't have to buy it for it to still work. And that, you know, there was a lot of people we interviewed who, you know, were onto the game, and we're not, you know, we're skeptical of all the kind of benefits that Uber might bring, or that Uber was promising, but they had like even less, like they had even lower expectations, you know, for, you know, the city government. So they weren't looking, you know, it's like if you talk to some people we talked to about, you know, Uber's the benefits in terms of racial justice, they'd be like, I don't know. But they weren't looking to City Hall or the political process for it. And so I think that's a big part of what we were kind of grappling with throughout the book. On the lowered expectations thing too, I mean, I really liked that as a title, and we went back and forth with the publisher, but you can't win them all, and I think I had a friend who was saying, people aren't going to buy a book that says lowered expectations. That's like, I don't have lowered expectations. I'm not going to buy that book. So but I do think it captures a good deal of what we were trying to get at. And I'll just add one more thing. We begin the book with this protest in downtown DC at the DuPont metro station, where there was a chant, Metro's a loser, I took an Uber. And it's this whole kind of, it's really weird, a really weird protest. But it was in the context of, basically a year of the metro falling apart. There was tons of track fires, tons of delays. And we kind of contrast that moment to the moment, and we draw on a really good book called The Great Society Subway by Zach Schrag, on the kind of original kind of ambitions of the metro, of DC's metro. And just that being, I mean, I think it gets to what you were saying about that vacuum in terms of ambitions has been filled by tech. That vacuum of that, it was apparent throughout, American history, or the history of American cities. We can build it. We can build it. And now it's Uber saying, no, Uber can build it. And unfortunately, for many people, that's convincing enough.
Yeah, it's and a lot of my writing on Uber, it's been particularly depressing because a lot of the visions they have are just lies.
Can we also, so everyone knows here, that you have been writing on this for a very long time, and that your writing has shaped the way we wrote the book?
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'm glad that, I think, like you said, the consensus has been fraying. I mean, even on the eve of Proposition 22, when it had been clear like this company hadn't really made money. This company didn't have autonomous vehicles. This company didn't know how to make money off of delivery, off of ride hail, and then they were trying to go into on-demand labor staffing. It still felt like there was a desire to plug them in and make it work because of how failed it seemed that people thought of as cities, right? Or people thought city governance was failed, that there were all these problems that would never be worked through with instruments inside of a city. But that Uber, or it felt like in a lot of the commentary, the subtext was that, if we integrate this ride-hail app, we can plug the gaps in one way or another, right? We can provide work for people who are underemployed. We can, address food deserts with on-demand delivery. And of course, all of that is bullshit, right? But I still, it still also feels like that dream, even when the consensus is fraying, hasn't entirely gone away, right? Because these companies seem, and that's also the sense I got from the book, is like these companies have just kind of shaped fundamentally the way we think, talk, and maybe even imagine or dream what cities can and should look like. I was in particular struck by, the chapter that you had on, your chapters on, the working conditions and on what workers thought of themselves. And you talked about the lowered expectations these workers had, right? A lot of the workers would reflect and say, well, those people, they didn't figure out the tips and the tricks that I did, and I'm going to be able to get by, or I don't really owe anything to any other drivers. I think of myself as an individual, or I'm atomized, so why should I even, think about larger questions of labor conditions, especially when I'm just trying to survive, right? So I guess, the million-dollar question is there a salve, or, are there steps that can be taken within city governance that kind of patch over or maybe put roadblocks to these kind of loopholes and exploits that these companies have been able to take advantage of, right? To fill themselves in the cracks of cities that are falling apart, or
Yes.
cities that have been blocked.
Yes. Yes. This is a $1 million question. We were just talking about this. On one hand, no, right? Like this is a okay, fine. Yes and no. Okay. First, the no. On one hand, no, it's a collective project, right? To imagine otherwise, to dream, to, imagine that we take care of each other in a way outside of market forces. On the other hand, there are these tiny baby steps that exist and are being taken, and it gives me great comfort. And I will highlight a few of them. One, in DC this year, we were able to add a 25-cent measly tax on all ride-hail services. Sure, crappy, yes. On the other hand, it's now funding $9 million worth of overnight bus lines, okay? And it started as part of a conversation about road pricing. We can also look to the cities and countries in the world that don't allow these companies to not offer death benefits, workers' comp, paid sick leave, holiday pay, right? These companies are like M&M. You know how like M&Ms in the US are made with that crappy red dye, but in the EU, isn't that true?
That particular food colorant is illegal in the EU.
Yes, thank you, Declan. I knew your Irish background is good. Okay, so like M&Ms in the US are made with a crappy dye. So Uber is using the red dye here, right? Like it's using the crappy, allowances of our governments because we don't tax them and allow them. They don't pay their fair share, right? We can think about the congestion they cause. We can think about the pollution from their exhaust. We can also think about even the EVs have what's the tire stuff, the forever chemicals from the tires on the road that kill the fish when it rains. I mean, there's a lot of negative, consequences of these things. And I think one way to start to imagine otherwise, right, is to level the playing field and have these companies pay their fair share so that then cities can really evaluate what kind of place they want.
Yeah. I tend to think of Uber as kind of like a tenuous achievement, partly because of what you're saying about the profit thing. Like at some point, that's got to come to like maybe not, but like it's got to come to some kind of reckoning, right? Whereas like okay, so they said they turned a profit last quarter. I'm holding out on Hubert Horan. So I'm waiting for him. I'm sure you know him. Like I'm waiting for him to tell me it's true or not before I believe it. But that the venture capital at some point, for example, has got to dry up, right? The reason that taxis are regulated in the first place is because they're not profitable, really, right? Unless regulated. So like there's like, and they're trying to make money out of it, like a sector of the economy which like just doesn't really generate money, which is why the state is involved, which is why it's considered a public good. So I'd hope that at some point, like, there's some internal contradictions that will like come to roost at some point. But I've been waiting, so we'll see. So yeah, and the other thing, as Katie is pointing out, like, there's lots of cities, like Uber is a global company with global ambition, but it has to deal with particular kinds of cities, with particular structures. And so I think our DC story, we try, show that it's a story that applies to other cities, and it does, but also there's specifics about DC that make it work. There's specifics about London that make it maybe work, but not kind of work. There's specifics about Austin, Texas that means it doesn't work, or Seattle. And so, and this is a big problem for Uber. So it's like, why are all these cities different? Why do you have to deal with different regulators and idiots in different cities, right? And why can't it all just be the same? And one of its goals, of course, is to make it all the same, right? But I think cities pushing back in all their kind of uniqueness is a big problem for companies like Uber, because it has to deal with like earlier we were talking about gaps, which I think is a really good point. It has to like Uber has to exist in the gaps in regulation, the gaps in transit systems, the gaps in labor. Which means it needs structures to exist in the first place, right? It needs, like, one of the reasons DC is so useful is because it has a transit system. So people don't own cars. And then there are first mile, last mile issues. So in order for it to like succeed, and then the resistance to it, I think is like, I think that is a big issue. Like the different cities have very different structures and geographies, and those matter. And I think eventually, I think, could cause it like huge issues in the long run,
And to your point, the next thing I wanted to ask is, I think we've been talking a lot about how Uber has, shaped or tried to make the terrain more amenable to itself. But, in your research, what are some of the ways in which you saw Uber, kind of develop in of itself, or maybe shift its aim and its project as it came up against governments, as it came up against the realities of like different cities, workers and their actual attitudes, how quickly they might burn out, how, under what circumstances they might try to organize or not organize. How much of the problem of Uber that we have now also came as a result of it realizing and learning and developing and evolving on its own in response to, DC as an example.
Well, I can say that one thing that I think they have developed over time is geofencing, which is, do you guys know what I mean when I say geofencing? It's used, can you say it, what it is?
So no?
So it's KAFUI, okay, you know what it is. Can you say what it is, and then I can tell my story.
Okay, so the geofencing, in particular with Ubers, they try to make sure, I'll use New York as an example, like they tried to make sure that drivers in the city that are registered with city, or specifically in the city, not spoofing their location, tracking where they are, and once they get out of certain locations, then maybe certain rules and different algorithms can be applied.
Yeah, so it's sort of like a way of surveillance, but it's also a way of micromanagement. And in DC, where this played out is at the DC airport, and it continues to, because when drivers enter certain geofenced areas, they can sometimes get out of their cars, they can sometimes rest a bit, and they could actually meet other drivers and create relationships where they might perhaps dream otherwise. And so I think that at the DC airport, that's one place in which we have seen them respond in terms of them starting to work with airport police to surveil the lot differently than they did before. That's one space in which I can think of where there has been some change in their game. And that sort of speaks to the earlier question, which I didn't really answer properly, but about what would it take for workers to not internalize the failures of the system and instead see themselves as set up to fail. And I think it's having that workplace or having that space in which, I mean, we're geographers, so we kind of think space matters. But having those, it's very hard in this workplace to see others and to see your struggles not as your own. And I think that Uber on some level must know that in those gathering places, there is sort of that fuel for that fire.
When I used to work with organizing drivers, the main places we would go to were these, airports, because exactly as you say, like drivers are resting there, they're playing guard games there, they're talking to each other there. That is pretty much the only place most of them see another driver, outside of green light hubs and group chats that they have with one another, right?
Yeah, which is interesting. So the Green Light Hub is a Uber worker center, and it's interesting in DC to track where it's moved, and it's moved increasingly outside of the city. And similarly, even we trace in the book somewhat, you're not going to find this that interesting, but for us it was important to see how even the worker, the TNC, the cell phone lot for ride-hail drivers kept getting moved. And at one point, it was very inaccessible to the airport, which also meant that it was not visible or easily surveilled. And after a protest there, after the Uber IPO, it got moved very close to the airport. And I think that, was useful for the company's relationship with its workers. Because the police will go around and say, okay, KAFUI, do you have your app on? Let me see. So that workers couldn't artificially create a surge. So if everybody in the room turns off the app, when a flight comes in, they can sort of jack up they can create what looks like a mismatch between the demand for rides for passengers on that flight and all the available drivers. And so the workers realized if they worked in unison, they had a teeny bit of power so they could get $4 more, $6 more per ride.
I think one of the things, as we've been tracking like Uber's development over the years, and it's hard to keep up, especially the pricing things and surge demand and all the different gamification things, is that like where they are real innovators is in like worker surveillance. Like it's really advanced, it's really scary and interesting and all these things at the same time. But that has been very innovative. And I do think I'm not enough of an expert on urban politics to say how much of their playbook is really new or innovative, but the scale of it feels quite astonishing. And I guess that's backed by the venture capital, but like when you look at things like the Uber files in Europe, because we're writing all this stuff and we're like, are we reading too much into it? And then bam, you're like, oh, well, we're actually reading way too little into it. This is like a huge political project on a global scale. And maybe that is somewhat innovative, like the direct link between, I mean, the link between capital and lobbying has always been strong, but the link between this particular type of venture capital and this particular kind of lobbying does feel a little bit new. And the speed at which it worked, right, which is quite astonishing. And the way in which like any opposition was just kind of swept away by this, general idea that, you're against innovation. Like our favorite character earlier on in the book was this guy called Ron Linton, who was the chair of the DC Taxi Cab Commission, the stepson of time, as KAFUI called him, in the book. And he was just kind of this dinosaur figure, He was like, we want regulation, I stand for taxis. And everyone's just like, who is this guy? Like, someone's embarrassing uncle who showed up at the wedding, right? Like, get rid of him. And that was kind of, it was very successful. So I think like that lobbying aspect of it has been and they've learned, I think, quite quickly, right? You see the speed at which Kalanick was replaced, It's like, you're bad for business, buddy, you're out, right? And so I think it has been a very, I hate the word innovation, but like, it's learned quickly, let's say,
Yeah, it's the tech part of the innovation is probably less, spectacular than the political innovation. Its ability to intervene in these kind of local political struggles and come out a winner, I think I think one of the things that we don't talk about in the book that much, but I wish we had, is this kind of the merry-go-round of, people in government working for Uber, people from Uber moving back to, this kind of weird relationship that, I mean, if you're in DC government, getting a job for Uber is like that you probably triple your salary, but that sort of, that kind of relationship. And I think, David Plouffe, who is a lead character in the introduction to the book, is just a kind of classic case of that. The quote I think we pull from him is about, the benefits of Uber, the benefits that Uber can provide cities for dealing with long-term wage stagnation. And it's like, dude, you were just in the White House. The benefits of Uber for dealing with, transportation deserts. It's like you had the ear of the most powerful, It's absurd, but it's also, kind of, it's representative of the kind of asymmetrical power that these kind of large-scale tech companies have vis-a-vis, these municipal governments with council people who are used to, dealing with complaints about, dog litter and parking. But that's the reality.
Yeah, no, I think one of the underrated stories of Uber is, of course, its political influence, but also the degree to which it had this economic PR program, right? Like most of the research that supported the expansion of Uber, that you guys, I know, have had to suffer through over the years, right? Is stuff that they just like funded themselves or like secretly funded, and someone didn't disclose a relationship or a paycheck or position in the company even, kind of like, rounding off the talking points in a way that I think has like seeped into people's preconceived notions, almost about, not just what the city can do, but also like what startups and these tech firms can do for us, And so maybe, like, are you guys worried that permanent, damage has been done here with these companies? That, like, we could corral them, we could, get rid of them, municipalize Uber, municipalize delivery firms or platforms, but that we will now have this permanent sort of thing to guard against, which is like, as soon as you run into some problems with city governance, a nimble enough firm in a big enough crisis will be able to convince everybody to jump ship.
Was that ever not the case?
Yeah, that's also true.
I mean, I like the
worry a
question.
bit. I was in Ireland over the summer visiting my family, and I went into a bar in Dublin, and they had surge pricing. Yeah. And Uber is illegal in Ireland, but surge pricing made it into the price of Guinness, which is like pretty big. Like it's like changing the price of baguettes or something in France. But so I do think it's gone to work on a lot of kind of like the project we've gone into, which Katie has really spearheaded, has been like delivery, like where Uber itself has gone, right? So we're following kind of how this is progressing, and it's a weird thing, right? Like people sit at home, or like, I'm kind of hungry, I want a bag of chips, and they get on their phone and someone brings it to them. That is a big change in how we think about ourselves. Someone shows up at your door with that like just junk food late at night, and you're just like, hey, thank you. That to me is like a profound shift in kind of just like, I mean, we always had delivery stuff, but there's something different about, right? Every neighborhood is full of delivery trucks bringing people the stuff they want. And so like this increasing division of like people who have time and money, people that don't have time and money, and in DC, it's really, really noticeable, right? Just the way that like our expectations of like cities and each other has changed, and then of course it's like okay, it's always been marketized to some degree, right? And nothing as much has changed, but the impersonal nature of it is like is really pronounced, right? You just like you don't even have to talk to anyone, it seems to appeal to a lot of people. I'm a talker, as you've probably guessed, so I like to interact with people. But for most people, it's kind of like, get an Uber. I don't have to deal with anyone. I don't have to talk to anyone. I don't have to get on a bus. You know.
Yeah, I think though, with that point, right, about the way in which the city, the scale of which these new operations exist, it does get worrisome, right, for the climate reason, right? You imagine all of that. But also, if we think back, when I was gesturing to sort of say, well, has it ever been different, right, your question? If we think about like Malcolm Harris's work on Palo Alto and tracing the history, right, of sort of Silicon Valley's long reach, we can almost look sort of romantically at sort of the railroad barons, because they built something, and the Carnegies built something. And I think Declan and KAFUI, we've often played with this question of like, yeah, but what if they just disappear tomorrow? What if Uber just disappears? What if Uber Eats disappears? What is the infrastructure that's going to have been left? Well, a lot of people waiting, right? And a lot of, what I fear is a lot of corner stores shutting down, right? The question is like, well, what is it that, you know, anyway.
Well, there's been some cases. I remember this is not in the book, but there were some small municipality. One was a small municipality in Florida, but then there was another one in Canada that
Innisfail.
Innisfail.
Yeah.
I
Great
never
name.
remember the name. I think Pinellas County, or Pinellas, somewhere in outside Tampa. You know, had, because they're suburban districts and everyone's spread out, they still have, you know, fixed route transit service, but you know, it's really costly. The ridership is low. Fare box revenue ratio is very, very low, and each of these places partnered with Uber to provide, you know, instead of providing fixed route service, they would provide residents who wanted to use public transit a voucher that they could then use to hail an Uber or a Lyft. In the Innisfail case, in Canada and Ontario, they went full on with this kind of public-private partnership, but they couldn't get enough drivers, right, to provide the service, and so they had just kind of abandoned their public transit system and gone with Uber, and then there was no like Uber drivers, and so people were stranded. And you know, this was a huge controversy. What has the city government done? Where are our buses? But I think that, you know, that is that in many ways is the danger.
No, I completely agree. I mean, Uber's not a transportation company, like self-professed, right? It's a transportation networking company. It's a data company that links people with cars or people who want rides, like ostensibly, right? And so it seems weird to start devolving transportation to companies who say they're not like it's agnostic about transportation, right? Like what it really wants obviously is data, and then like, you know, the ability to scale that up and monopolize things and, you know, I don't know, create some kind of super, whatever it wants to do in the future, who knows? But transportation is just a means to an end in that sense, right? Which is not how cities should think about it, at least, whether that is how they think about it or not. And so the question of what do they leave behind is like, just broken infrastructures, underfunded infrastructures. And so we see this a little bit with like the AV experiments, right? It's like, here's an AV bus route. Oh, that company went bankrupt, it's gone, right? And you know, building cities that way seems like a really, really risky proposition, right? Again, to treat these things as like they're here, they're gonna stay, they're a reality of urban infrastructure, I think is not the way to think about them. Like they're parasitic. They don't build anything. They just feed off things that have already been built or are crumbling, but like need investment. I think, yeah, I agree. I think that's the big risk.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I agree with everything you said. The kids these days, you know, part of it is they're all right. Yeah, it's like, you know, we're sacrificing a social safety net for a Shake Shack burger that will be delivered to you in 10 minutes, and you know, we're thinking with our stomach cold.
Love the questions and the energy. Hang on to it because we have a virtual audience and we're also recording for a podcast. So hang on to it, please. I don't want to shut anyone down, but we also have to. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Question in the back?
Oh, you want to go to questions?
Oh, wait, what time are we at?
Yeah, okay. Okay, can we use your mic too? You want to get the question on the mic too?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. You know, if you're born like after 1960, they jacked you. And then they try to say we're the same generation. It's not that. And I did want to address you about the deliveries, man. Half that stuff is so nasty. I would want to eat that. I sit up with these guys in Wendy's, these people that actually bring your food. The way they handle the food, the way they've never washed their hands, the way they go into the bathroom that they let them use, which is disgusting, and they come out, they don't wash their hands, and they're taking your food and giving it to you. I mean, I see it as not a privilege, because the real privileged people aren't going to have their food delivered like that, and they're not going to eat that. And then real privileged people still have time to cook their food. So you're looking at it, in my opinion, a little warped there, you know. And the to come out and go to the diner, they killed the diners long ago when they started the racism, and just when we broke the racism and got like electric ladyland waitresses from all over the world, they decided that wasn't good enough, and they went with cheaper labor. And that's why the diners went out of business. Every guy, every person came into the diner and had their waitress that they wanted to go to, that they could talk to about anything, the theater, this, the that. And when that ended, no one wanted to go to the diner, and that's when they went out of business.
Just a reminder, if you're shy and don't want to get on mic, we have forms you can fill out. We'll go around and collect them, hand it to our panel. Raise your hand if you want to go on mic. Okay, we'll do one question here and then.
Thanks so much. This has been really interesting. So one thing that always seems sort of peculiar to me about Uber's strategy in adapting this sort of, moralistic, we're solving racism argument, and when companies do things like that in general, is that before they even make these arguments, they're already walking into, a playing field that is in their favor for all of the reasons you've been talking about in terms of a weakened labor movement, in terms of taxation policies. And they're also confronting an American public that already has, for the most part, a pretty positive view of capitalism and corporations. So, but why does Uber feel then that these kind of moral arguments are necessary to its success? And is it right that they are that necessary? Like if Uber kind of dropped that whole shtick and just used, the existing structure, how successful do you think it's a counterfactual, so I know you can't fully answer.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things that we didn't mention, but KAFUI, I think you talked, we used to talk a good bit about, is that like Uber can make the argument in DC that it's making a moralistic argument about solving racism, but it also has to make the counter argument of like, let's say, so if it's destroying the taxi industry, the majority of the taxi drivers in DC are people of color, right? Ethiopian, Somalia, and African American. So like they're also under, I think, a lot of pressure to make an argument that like, while taking away with one hand, it's giving with another hand. I think that might be part of it in the DC context, and of course, like just the general attack on like public infrastructure in DC, which again, like the metro system, WMATA, and so on, is like a lot of good middle class jobs or urban class jobs for again a lot of African Americans in DC. So I think like it might have something to do with that, but I do take your point that like it's a good counterfactual.
Yeah, the first thing that, I guess, I kind of chalk it up to, there's this, I associate it with kind of American corporations, this kind of weird commitment to like doing good while doing well, or doing, it's this weird, I don't know, it's the need to kind of, appeal to something more than just profit and hard cash, some of it comes through, it's just marketing. Uber's in competition with other companies, and so, you know, they need a brand that in some cases has been tarnished by events, but that they need to repurpose, scuff off, and it's about brand management. That's kind of what I associate it with, even if it's skin deep. Although some people might actually believe it. I feel like the lobbyists we talk to, as weird and as perverse as it might sound, you know, was kind of a true believer. You know, when he was saying, you know, people from old DC and new DC, they get in the cab, and they're having these like vibrant conversations. You know, I think he actually believed that. I mean, it speaks to a lack of any kind of structural analysis of anything, but I don't know.
You know, one thing I think also to add is I really do think the moral arguments played a role in the rhetorical and the lobbying, because, you know, in a lot of these cities, they were illegal. You know, like they were just legal for the earliest years of operations, which were some of the most important ones. And, you know, as you talk about in DC, and I think as, like, you know, you go through the history of whether it's San Francisco, Los Angeles, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Paris, pretty much anywhere where they've operated, there's been there have been windows where there's been a massive hammer that's hanging over their head that could have crushed their skull, right? And the moral arguments, either from real believers or from cynics, I think did help play defense and did help obfuscate and did help distract and buy time for them to figure out how to weaken and undermine this or that regulation, right? Or to normalize it, or to convince people that they don't need to enforce the law, you know, because in some of these places there's still an opportunity to enforce the law, and this moralism that they've been able to push, as well as the normalization, has convinced them otherwise, you know. And now we're in like a holding pattern in a lot of cities, waiting for, you know, one of the levees to break, essentially.
Hi, I'm Lynn, and I handed mine in, but I'll go ahead and read it. I lived in DC for like 15 years until about 2005, and I was spending a lot of time doing various sorts of organizing, including with Justice for Janitors, and for a while we were working together with the union that was organizing taxi workers, who were largely Eritrean at the time. This might be a little bit before the rise of Uber, right? So I'm interested in a couple of things about the DC-ness of this situation, and one being the DC's status, you know, with sort of very tenuous home rule. During the time I was there was actually like a takeover, right, from Congress, right, and put into fiscal control. And that no longer is the case, but, you know, given the relative lack of autonomy of the city, like that hasn't been raised, and I don't know if it has had any impact at all in the story. And then I was also interested in this interplay around the situation with kind of a racial bias, which then you also talked about when it came up around, you know, the sort of branding of Uber, because, you know, certainly at that time, so many of the taxi workers were, you know, Eritrean or Somalian, right, you know, and otherwise, which, you know, kind of would, how did that like kind of fit into the story? But then, you know, DC's also gone through this hyper-gentrification for so long, right? So just kind of interested in the DC-ness of the story.
Thanks for that question. I will answer the first bit about the DC-ness, which is great. When she said home rule, do you guys know what that means? When she said the limited home rule, the ability. Okay, so DC for about 100 years didn't have the ability to elect its own mayor or city council. It was a reaction actually to racism of the U.S. Congress after Reconstruction. They said, hey, you've got too much racial progress. We're going to cut that back. So from 1874 till 1974, DC DC residents didn't have the ability to set their own laws, let alone dictate their future. So what's interesting and what we were not, I don't think I was expecting as we dug into it, was why DC was so special to Uber as well as other AV companies was this very point that they did have limited control, that there was Congress was sort of looking over their shoulder. But what was most important, I think, is that there isn't a state level to undo any progress they make within the city. So one of the things a lot of these companies have hit, one of the barriers they've hit, is that they will get a law passed in a certain city and then a state might undo it. And so what's nice is you win DC, you are done, okay? And so what they've done is they took the DC law and laws, and they've picked it up and dropped it in many other places. And so they are now working now, right, much more so than a decade ago at the state level across the US. So we're seeing a battle this year in Massachusetts play out, right, but not in Boston, right? And I think that difference, that's a difference of a decade because they learned the hard way that even though these things used to get regulated at the municipal level, that they have to play the state game.
As for the taxi driver element, I mean, I don't think we're experts on it, but in our early interviews, a lot of them were with Eritrean and Ethiopian taxi drivers who were, I would say, when Uber first came to DC, it came as a black car service, and then Uber X came later. Most of those black car drivers, at least anecdotally, I mean, we don't have data, were immigrant drivers, were Ethiopian and Eritrean. And they were very much the kind of the early labor force for Uber. A lot of them had black cars. A lot of them went into debt to buy one. Like, it was a whole kind of process. And I think a lot of them felt shortchanged when Uber X came out and it became a broader thing. They started to make less money. They had invested a lot of money in buying new cars. And there was a whole scheme for a while. I remember of driving to Florida to buy cars because they were cheaper. And coming back to DC, there was a whole... And so I think that that driver community was really important to Uber's entry into the city. They're also, I think, and a lot of them we've talked to are part of organizing efforts as well against Uber and against the taxi industry. So they've had this very, very key role in the story, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and the taxi industry in DC is different than other major metropolitan areas. It doesn't have a medallion system, you know. I think that changes the structure as well. It's a lot of independent operators. There are some companies, but a lot of, you know, it's easier to enter, or was easier to enter into the industry. And I think that probably played some of a role in the kind of, you know, the lack of strong pushback from, I don't know, we don't talk too much about this in the book, but it was something that I remember thinking about, which is that, yeah, this is a place that, you know, it doesn't have it's very different than, say, New York or Chicago or San Francisco.
I wanted to read this question here from Mariah. There are two questions, really. The first is saying, a lot has changed since Uber entered DC. It's rebranded with Darkar Shahi. It's turned a profit. It's not in the Obama techno-optimism. They're closer to a monopoly rather than an underdog, but what has survived in their DNA, and what lessons are still relevant from all this? I would, me personally, yeah. I don't. I don't know how much has actually changed with Darkar Shahi. He sold off most of the sci-fi projects, right? The flying cars, autonomous vehicles.
Even the bikes, I think.
Yeah, the bikes. Yeah, I mean, I had a colleague who reported on how they were burning piles of them and trying to get rid of them as much as possible, right? So they got rid of a lot of the things that were so clearly lies they fed investors so that they could rationalize more money to get another try at monopolizing. But I don't know. I mean, like, do you guys feel how much has changed? Because it feels like the business model's the same, if a little bit more brutal. They introduced the quota system in New York, which was like an attempt. New York City passed, minimum wage laws, and then they instituted a quota system that, strategically fired people if they didn't effectively work 60+ hours, and then got rid of it during the pandemic, then brought it back in different forms. So I don't know if, my sense of it is the company's just been a little bit better with its messaging and realizing that you can't be as brutal and also more successful with its lobbying, right?
Yeah, I wonder if going public had some kind of change in a lot of it, right? Where they got better at messaging around that time. They've gotten, maybe they're under more pressure. The unicorn phase has kind of worn off, so they're under a lot more pressure, and so they've been maybe a little tighter with their what they're up to. But I mean, the DNA is the DNA. It's a corporation that want to make money out of transportation. I don't think it can change that dramatically. Surface level, sure, but yeah, I mean, I think maybe a big shift is the delivery thing. Something, because the way we kind of traced it in DC was like, okay, it's a black car service that's competing with other black cars. Now it's Uber X is competing with other taxis. And then Uber Pool and all the other stuff, it's like trying to offer itself as an alternative to transit more generally. And then it kind of just like, okay, well, whatever about that. Now we're just delivering stuff. And that shift feels a little bit different, maybe. But the bottom line, I guess, is the same. Yeah, that's a good question. And there's another one here, which I think is also a good question. What's the deal with Lyft? I mean, we kind of threw Lyft to one side because we were like, okay, we can't just keep writing Uber and Lyft. But I think they're the same. I mean, for a while, it was like Lyft is the good company because
yes, I remember that.
Everyone drivers used to tell us that.
No,
yeah,
Lyft is they're good. They're good. And I think they had a different. Early on, they had different.
5% less cut. I think it was 20 versus 25%. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, less. I mean, they also had. It was harder to sign up for Lyft. They seem to have. Yeah, you had to meet someone as opposed to just signing up online. So I think it had the reputation of being like, upscale. I don't know, upscale Uber. I don't know, like a better operator, but Uber, Uber with class. I don't know.
Eco-friendly.
Yeah,
they tried to do the green pivot earlier.
Yeah, so but there's, I think since we started the research, there's been other, entrants into the market.
Yeah, no, I'll just say one thing about Lyft that really concerns me, which is its relationship to bikes in New York City. Maybe you have something on that, but the story is that Lyft wants to sell off its bikes because it's not getting enough ride hail. Right, but the earth is on fire, and that's where we're really letting these people decide how our cities operate.
Well, it was interesting because I remember who were we talking? Oh, I can't say the name.
Thank you, KAFUI.
I remember when we were talking with a planner that was saying that Uber had looked when it first invested in bikes, they had looked into their data and they were seeing that more than half of the trips that they were taking were less than like a mile or something like that. And so they're like, there's a huge opportunity here. Am I getting that right? Huge opportunity here for micro mobility. So bikes, not just bikes, but scooters, that sort of thing. And so the fact that they're selling that off is interesting. I don't know much more than that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I feel like whoever proves this will get an award, but I suspect that they're colluding, or they were in early days when they both, in the early days of their competition, they had price war, and they more or less froze prices and were able to kind of set conditions that together that workers would enter when they'd go into the industry. And I think that sort of teamwork helped also when they started doing their lobbying and regulatory fights, right? Prop 22 is the main one, right? They spent $200 million together along with DoorDash to get their specific laws, the labor law of the land. So I think the deal with Lyft also is like, it wasn't able to get a monopoly. It's never ever going to be able to usurp Uber, right? Probably. They are probably like useful shock troops in various regulatory battles, and friends.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Jacob. I'm at CUNY Graduate Center Sociology program. I've been studying kitchens and how they've been reorganized around platforms. I think it's really interesting conversation that's happening right now that you all are presenting, because it's essentially one step removed from what I'm looking at. I've also worked in restaurants for about 20 years here in New York City before I came around to study this world. And I just want to ask two-part question about some issues that I think I'm seeing, and I'm wondering if you're also seeing it as well. One is platforms not only change the sort of relations and conditions of labor in the space that they enter, but they also change the sort of nature of what it is that people are doing. People who are cooking for delivery are not cooking in the same way that restaurants cook for people who come and sit down, the way that caterers operate, et cetera. So inside the actual space of production, right, things are changing in a significant way. But I've also noticed that outside the space of production, things are changing in very dramatic ways. For example, the city streets themselves have become the front of house of the restaurant, right? So delivery workers are now taking the role of in essence, the servers or the hosts or all of these other functions that bring the food from point A to B. Significantly changing the way public space is used in the city, but also how social life is organized around it. So I wonder if you all would just speak to those two issues.
Yes, I will, Jacob. Thanks for that question. I want to talk about it in two ways. First, I just want to talk globally a little bit about cloud kitchens, which you probably are aware of. So Uber's former CEO, Travis Kalanick, his project after he left Uber, and his current project, which is alive and well in the US, is something called cloud kitchens. And it is building ghost kitchens or virtual kitchens. And he's doing it, including in DC, and they're using, what are they called? What are the tax credit things called? Distress tax credits to buy up industrial property in DC and elsewhere, and then repurpose it into like the takeout kitchen. And so I'm really worried about what that means for the way cities work and how they think about sort of restaurants and meals and food, and the way we give it to each other is shifting. And I think that sort of on a different scale, on the scale of sort of two individuals, one of the things that sort of was apparent in doing this work was sort of that constant old question about like, well, who would do this work if not for these workers? And the late David Graeber once said, well, moms, like women, your mom would have cooked for you. Your mom would drive you to the airport at 5 a.m., right? Your mom will get your laundry, walk your dog, do these things. And so I think when you're talking about the restaurant, we've thought a lot about the experience. We followed this year 40 instant delivery drivers and their experiences, right? And so that front of house, right, that is a new workspace. And there's a lot of benefits to it for workers, but there's a lot of drawbacks. And so I'm excited to learn more about your work.
Yeah. Well, one of the other things that kind of came out of this was like a chat about the way that, like, we were talking about production, the way that work changes. And we were trying to write a paper about this. We kind of did. Like, we fudged it a bit at the end. But like the way that like a work day gets broken down, right? So the way that like you're waiting out front of the restaurant for the meal to come out as a driver, but you're not actually paid for standing there waiting. You might get a fine, you might get a ticket, anything could happen. But like it's this kind of like, you're only on when the app says you're on. I mean, you're generating data. you're doing work, but you're not paid for it. And so there's this like one of the innovations of these companies is to like restructure how we think about work, like the flexibility aspect. So like loads of people do work, and they're, you know, I'm a professor. I sit at my desk and stare at the wall sometimes for 20 minutes, right? You know, the idea that work only happens in these short, intense periods, and then everything else is unpaid. That's been a really interesting, or is a really interesting innovation, I think. This kind of like, I don't know what you call it. Some people call it, you know, a new form of Taylorism or whatever, but it is a really kind of like segmented type of day that, and this is of course how they generate, if they do ever, profit, right? By paying for these really short periods, but you're in your car driving around all day doing this stuff, but you get paid for it. And like the percentage breakdown is difficult to calculate, but it's a shift.
Thanks so much for this. I am interested, I love the idea of lowered expectations as a framing for a lot of the work that Uber has been doing. I'm wondering about the lowered expectations in kind of like the academic and research and lobbying space. You know, you mentioned that guy who wrote the op-ed that served Uber's interest that was funded by Uber. There's other researchers who have produced research that is favorable to Uber, and then you find out that it's funded by Uber. Can you talk about how Uber is either setting or following a playbook of buying academic influence, and how you go about uncovering those connections?
Yes. Big oil, big tobacco. This is nothing new. I really do think. I think they are following a playbook, right? If we look at how propaganda, I mean, DEET, wait, wasn't DEET, is that what it was? What was sprayed? My dad used to run through it. What? Oh, DDT. They used to run through it, right? I mean, we have a whole history, right, of researchers that are employed by industry to purport a particular view. And so I think in many ways, this is a way to think about it. And I think one of the shocking things for me was years ago looking at the amount of money annually that that Uber in particular spends on these expenditures. Can you do that? The amount of money spent on that particular project, and it set it apart in my head, right? That was a very different kind of entity, at least on the DC scale, of a company coming in with that kind of research, that kind of support, those kind of lobbyists, those kind of researchers. Yeah.
Hi, yeah. Following up on what Jacob asked about and what you mentioned earlier with government regulation, New York City is experiencing the accumulation of Uber Eats delivery guys in front of a Chick-fil-A or a Shake Shack. And the real question is, should the government begin to accommodate and regulate those spaces? Because on one hand, you're supporting all these individual workers that we want to support, but also you're supporting a company like Uber that is also enabling them. So what does your research say on the direction for the government?
That's a great question. I think what our DC government is doing, right, and Dan works for the Department of Transportation, so is keenly aware of sort of these issues. In DC, what was so harrowing for us was the extent to which the DC Department of Transportation has no data about where these clusterfucks are happening, as well as like what possibilities they could even do about it. They don't even know what rulemaking they can do, and that's what's really hard. So it's really hard to govern something you can't see, which I think is a situation for our regulators, and they also aren't really sure what power they even hold. Because in DC, anyway, all the sort of cards are held by these private entities. And we have this weird provision in DC where they're anti-FOIA-able. So they cannot, any information that the city even accumulates can't be FOIA'd by, like, let's say researchers or former journalists. So it's really hard to solve those problems. DC, actually, our Department of Transportation sent out a single human with pen and paper to note 16,000 encounters in what they called a sample PUDO zone, a pickup drop-off zone. That information was not released publicly, but I think the question of what do you do about it, I don't know what you do about it, but my God, we can't just, like look what's happening to bike zones. Right now we have restaurants, a restaurant is called Hip City Veg. What do you think their opposition is to bike lanes, right? Okay, it's a vegan restaurant, and they're against bicycles. Anyway, the thing is, you end up with these really weird conflicts, right? So I don't know what the solutions are, but certainly sort of this mass congestion, you know, I think isn't compatible with a sustainable place.
By the way, Uber can FOIA you, and city employees, I should say, and they do quite frequently, which we found out. So there's this like weird asymmetry in FOIA.
Well, I was going to say it's interesting. I mean, I think there's, in terms of where government steps in, I mean, in some cases it'll have to step in. Oftentimes, where the conflict is between residents who don't like, you know, this huge mass of people waiting, or you know, with bicycles for orders, and then the company, right? And it has to choose a side. I think there's an interesting. I was just thinking about this because on my way here, I passed the new Vanderbilt Tower, which is next to Grand Central Station, and they have, you know, like the building itself was built recently and has like a whole massive elevator, and it has Grubhub, it has Uber Eats, it has all these. It's like it's the building has been built to purpose for the gig economy, and I think and that's private, obviously, but I think we'll see more of that, you know, where you just have Uber waiting rooms built, you know, or where in some cases it's now a private matter, not off the public street. So that
And I think you see a bit of that. Like I was actually thinking about this the other day. I was trying to figure out like who pays fines when and obviously like FedEx and UPS rack up like millions and millions of dollars of fines every year in New York City, but the company just takes that as like an operating cost. I think in the case of delivery drivers foot that bill as in the case as everything else. So it's definitely something. I mean, I know the DC Department of Transportation is thinking about it, but again, I think thinking about it and doing something about it are probably pretty separate here. Yeah.
So I wanted to add one thing also, like bathroom breaks, right? You know, because the structure of the work is this weird on when we say you're on and not. You don't get, of course, the basic protections, but one of them including, like, when you're doing these long shifts, you can't really use the bathrooms. And in fact, not only that, but attitudes end up festering among establishments where you deny the workers access to the bathrooms because there's the idea that they're messier, that they are gonna come in and cause a ruckus, and you know that also contributes. I worry to like a deeper, more wider spread sentiment that will lend people to be more oppositional to regulation, minimum wage laws, you know, fair pay laws that just get people what they're owed at the very least, right? Mm-hmm.
Well, from what you're saying, and given what happened in California with Prop 22, correct? That was the number of it. It sounds like the real threat to these companies is the classification of their workers as employees, right? And their model would fall apart, I think, basically, if that happened. And it amazes me that some states, like the one I'm from, Connecticut, use something called the ABC test to determine if you're an independent contractor or not. And, even in states like that where I was, and I retired just before Uber and Lyft really took off, but a lot of other companies were already sort of violating the ABC test. They have to pass every criteria in order to be a true independent contractor. And given the direction of the degree of direction and control which you've described, it'd be hard for them to deny we don't really control, these drivers. But I remember when I was a wage enforcement agent for the Labor Department, I went to my boss and I said, well, why don't we go after FedEx? You know, it's ridiculous that, you know, they claim these people aren't their employees. They wear their uniforms, they drive trucks with their name on it, they tell them where to go. And his answer was, well, you know, you're right, they are employees, but you know, we have to look at the political side of this question and what's going to happen in the state legislature if the Labor Department suddenly starts going after these, what he said, you know, were these multi-international companies. So, you know, even unfortunately where you have a law that would allow you to go after them, the political structure still isn't ready to use it, unfortunately, because they buy into this capitalist model that, you know, they know what they're doing, they're innovative, they're going to solve everything, and we don't have to do anything, right? I mean, so I was just wondering, in DC, have they ever done any study about whether all the promises Uber made came true, or because they gave them the green light, they're sort of like, you know, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil?
Yeah, I mean, we hope our work is part of that reassessment. But I would also say that in DC, it's interesting, we do have the ABC test in place, but only for the construction trades, because the way in which sort of the union and the labor movement has been so sectoral, it has meant that any of our attempts to try to get the specific language stricken from the law that would apply it to, let's say, domestic workers, nail salon technicians, and gig workers, right, in the tech industry, those efforts have sort of been for naught so far.
Yeah, and it's exactly as you describe it. And it's even fun. Like it's stranger. Like you see. So if workers are classified as independent contractors and they group together to like make surge prices, or it's collusion. So Uber can actually use antitrust like argument against these workers. So like it's a double bind. It's really. Yeah. But I think you're right. The tools are there. It's the political will to use them is what's lacking, right?
One more.
Yeah, thank you so much for all this. Some of the trends that are big topics that I felt underlying these issues were privatization, surveillance, data, and regulation, and like rights of people to the city versus capital. And so I was wondering, what movements or segments in society do you see reconstituting the notion of rights in a way that is challenging these corporate narratives and kind of overcoming this atomized driver outlook that just because I want to sit in my car until 3 o'clock in the morning means no one else should get anything nice? Yeah.
I love that question. This is a great one, I think, to end on. I can say on a very sort of starting small, the good news is in DC, we have a new group of gig workers organizing, and it's interesting. It's a group of Bangladeshi Uber drivers that were first organizing their apartment around rent issues, and they realized they also had very similar workplace concerns. So that is a new organization called ACE Collaborative that is getting going. Sort of as we scale up, certainly there are many visions being put forward by Green New Deal allies and advocates for how we can build better places, we can scale up, and there's other, anything else you guys want to highlight?
Yeah. Well, because I know Eric is in the back, and I want to, you know, there's a new drivers cooperative operating in New York that has a lot of potential and is doing really, really well, and is operating on a different model. So I just want to talk to Eric about all that.
Yeah, but worker co-ops.
But worker co-ops, yeah.
I think as much as we hammer the DC Council on a regular basis in the book, there are voices in the DC Council that are, sympathetic to doing things differently. And I mean, DC is a strangely progressive city in a lot of ways, so it's not all terrible.
I mean, we have 3 DSA members on council.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Which Marion Barry is the question, right?
Hey, he ended well. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So much for coming, and thank you for all the
This has
questions.
been great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I guess we'll be signing books over there. So
Please stay, support the authors. We're going to bring this table over.
Buy a copy, buy two, buy three.